With that, I'll introduce our first speaker and we'll get rolling. Our first speaker is Brian Shillinglaw, and he directs New Forest's U.S. investment business, leading forest carbon offset project evaluation, landowner partnerships, and project management. Brian has over 7 years of experience with environmental markets, investment, and climate policy. Brian holds a Bachelor of Arts from Harvard University, a Doctor of Law from Stanford Law School, and a Master of Science from the Interdisciplinary Program on Environment and Resources at Stanford University. Let's welcome Brian.
So, thank you, Brian. Thank you, John, for the invitation to speak, and to ITC for the invitation to speak. We're honored to be here. And in kicking this off, I'll introduce a little bit about the California compliance market and the protocol. And Greg will be discussing a little bit about the market from the perspective of a longtime tribal forester. And Greg's team and our team have worked together on the two projects registered under the California Compliance Offset Protocol on tribal land to date: the Yurok Tribe Forest Carbon Partners CKGG Improved Forest Management Project and the Round Valley Indian Tribes Project. And so, Greg liked the way we were working, and we really value Greg's team, decades of experience in tribal forestry and tribal forest management goals. So how many folks in the room are currently developing a forest carbon project how many folks know another tribe or a landowner who is developing a carbon project, a forest carbon project? Okay, so a good chunk of the room. So, in terms of, and I'll take about 20 minutes here to introduce the market and the protocol. I'll chat briefly about New Forests, a brief overview of the market, and then we'll get into how the California offset protocol works, and then flag some things to think about, some key considerations for tribes. So, New Forests, we're a timberland investment manager. We manage about 1.5 million acres globally in multiple sawmills. We're the largest timberland manager in Australia, and we have offices in San Francisco and Singapore. But our company, which was once a part of Hancock Timber Resources Group, was really founded on the belief that forests produce multiple values to society in addition to wood products, and that landowners are going to begin to be paid for delivering water quantity, water quality, carbon sequestration, and wildlife habitat. And so because of that, our CEO was on the first committee that drafted the first version of the offset protocol that California eventually adopted over 12 years ago. And we've been helping to push this forward over that time. And this is really the first time that at scale there's a price for building inventory, for growing inventory, maintaining inventory in the United States. And it's a major change in forest economics. We've registered the first compliance protocol forest carbon project and the most to date under the California Compliance Protocol. As I mentioned, the only project developer to successfully verify and register with the Air Resources Board projects on Native American trust and fee land to date. There's a couple other projects in the pipeline that you'll hear about that were on trust and fee land. And so offset track record we're a leading supplier of offsets in the system, and we've delivered millions in revenue to landowner clients, primarily to Native American landowners. So after that brief introduction, why is this all here? So the fundamental challenge is that as a society, we're polluting at such a rate in greenhouse gases that we're trending towards 1,000 parts per million by the end of the century of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the last time there was 1,000 parts per million in the atmosphere, there were subtropical forests at the poles. So that's happening in a very short period of time, and it's a major challenge for us as a community. And California is the 8th largest economy in the world. Acting on that science, passed a law in 2006 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state. They're targeting 1990 levels by 2020. And there's a variety of policy mechanisms to achieve that, including forcing the utilities to build out more wind and solar, having a low carbon fuel standard. But they also created a cap and trade system. And cap and trade was originally developed under the Bush Senior administration. It was a Republican environmental innovation that was first used to address sulfur dioxide pollution. And this has been ported into the greenhouse gas realm. And so the cap and trade market includes the use of offsets, with an expected demand of 150 to 200 million offsets in aggregate by 2020. And current offset supply is constrained relative to demand. I think we're up to, not counting retired offsets, maybe 17 million offsets right now that are available for use. So the way this works is that regulated businesses in the state of California, so you're really talking about the large oil and gas, electric power companies, industrial companies, they can individually pollute as much as they decide to in their businesses, but they have to have a permit called a California carbon allowance or an offset for every ton of pollution they emit. And you can only meet up to 8% of your pollution with offsets. So if I pollute 100 tons, I have to turn in at least 92 California carbon allowances and up to 8 offsets. And so California, the allowances, the permits to pollute are issued in limited and declining quantities, which creates a cap on the overall level of pollution. So the reason the system was adopted is because if you just tax the pollution, you're not sure how much pollution you get. You might have the same level of pollution at just a higher cost, but with a cap, you know you're getting less and less pollution over time. So the way this really works is you can see the columns represent expected business as usual emissions in California. It jumps up in 2015 because in 2015 you get the inclusion of transportation fuels and natural gas for home heating. And the red line represents the number of permits issued by the state of California to auction to pollute. And these permits are auctioned annually. And you can see the number of permits. The red line goes down every year relative to expected business as usual pollution. So that difference is what the system forces in pollution. Part of that's accomplished by offset projects, and part of that's accomplished internally to polluting industries. Now, the permits are auctioned quarterly, and there's a minimum price in the auction that goes up by approximately 7% per year. And so the state of California says, okay, you individually, all of you guys will pollute no more than X, and if you want to pollute, it's going to cost you at least this much, and next year it's going to cost more, and there are going to be fewer permits. There's been about $4.2 billion of the permits auctioned to date in the past 2 years. So from when you're looking at a company like Chevron or PG&E, this is a multi-$100 million liability per annum that they have a team of people tasked to manage. And what this is doing is the offset market that is being created by this is worth about $1.5 to $3 billion through 2020, more thereafter. And forest landowners have produced the majority of offset supply to date. So a lot of that value is going to go to forest landowners. And it's a major price signal. So keeping track of my time here. So this is a little bit of the price history. This graph shows volume in the gray bars. This is the permits to pollute are traded on a commodity futures exchange, a secondary market after they're issued. And so this tracks that price history. You can see it spiked in the early years of the system. That was when a nuclear power plant went offline, and all of that greenhouse gas-free power had to be replaced with coal and gas power. Right now, it's roughly tracking the price floor, and it will over the next few years. It will go up gradually. And you can see the volume ramping up. Offsets trade, this is a little bit outdated now. It's a 10 to 20% discount, but the offsets trade at a discount to the allowances for reasons that I won't get into great detail about. And so you can see a little bit of the price history. So the way the protocol works is there's 3 different types. There's multiple protocols, first of all. There's a protocol for the capturing and flaring of methane from dairy lagoons, coal mine methane protocol. There's a rice protocol that's being adopted for rice management, because paddies can produce methane. And then there's a destruction of ozone-depleting substances, leaking stockpiles of refrigerants. But for our purposes, this protocol was developed over a period of almost a decade and adopted by the state of California in 2011. and now it's being subsequently tweaked. And so there's 3 different project types within the protocol. I'm going to focus on improved forest management. Avoided conversion involves the placement of a permanent conservation easement preventing the conversion of the forest land to a non-forest use. Reforestation involves obviously tree planting. Reforestation tends not to pencil out unless you're doing it for other reasons than carbon revenue. Avoided conversion tends to pencil out best if you have land that could be converted to agriculture or entirely to a non-forest use. But improved forest management is what's going to be most useful to most landowners. And there, your offset projects are credited for actual carbon stocks relative to a baseline. The baseline reflects both common inventory in the region, in your forest type and region, and it also reflects what is the most aggressive, legally and financially feasible timber harvest on your land in particular. So a little bit about how quantification works. So you start with a common practice number, and so this system has taken the U.S. Forest Service FIA data set and divided up the country into different ecoregions and different forest types. And for each of those, the U.S. Forest Service has crunched the data to come up with a common average stocking of, and in this case, of carbon dioxide per unit area. Previously, this was also expressed in board foot volume and carbon. But so you start with an average, which essentially reflects average industrial management in your region. In this case, I picked Oregon and Washington coast. And then this system tends to be most useful when your current inventory is better than average. Your current inventory is higher than your average landowner in the region. So we start with current inventory, and then there's a baseline model where you model out. You have to prove that it's financially and legally feasible to significantly reduce your inventory, and you can't, even if it would be legally feasible to reduce it below current average practice in your region, the system won't let you do that because there's a business reason that most people are keeping an average stocking of that. You average that over 100 years. You add in the wood products that are generated by that harvest schedule, because the wood products also keep carbon out of the atmosphere, and that becomes your baseline. And then in the quantification, you can be issued credits in the first year for your current stocks that are over the baseline, and then thereafter you can be issued credits for annual sequestration in your forest. And you don't have to sell all the credits that you're issued. In fact, if you're in an area where you need to catch up on forest thinning or on a lot of fire treatments, you want to make sure that you leave some room to do all of the timber harvest that you want. The system does not preclude active timber harvest. You just have to maintain your obligated carbon. And but it gives you this real option every year where you can sell the annual growth in your forest as a carbon storage, or you can sell it for logs, or for any given 3 or 5 year period. So you have access to 2 commodity markets instead of 1. So the key obligations, this is not a free lunch. The core obligation is that you're committing to maintain a certain level of inventory on the project area for 100 years from the date of issuance. And you can exit the project at any time, but you have to replace offsets that were sold, plus replace offsets that were issued, plus an additional number if you're terminating within the first 50 years. Conservation easements are not required. The natural forest management and sustainable harvesting are required. The sustainable harvesting can be mapped through your forest management plan approved by BIA. Natural forest management includes a variety of criteria. One of the key features is it does include a 48-foot clear-cut limit. So if you're managing with larger average clear-cut sizes, that's something to consider. And there's no penalty for unintentional destruction of carbon stocks. So if it's a wildfire that burns through a beetle outbreak, that's covered through a mutual insurance reserve that all projects contribute to within the system. And then you have you have monitoring and maintenance obligations, where you have to have an on-site verification at least every 6 years. The inventory has to be updated at least every 12 years. And then the last thing that I want to flag, and this is important to think about, is that credits can be invalidated for a period of time after they're issued for fraud if you're selling the same credits from the same trees into multiple systems, for gross overissuance, and also for environmental health and safety violations in the project area. And if you re-verify within 3 years, that invalidation risk runs out after 3 years. If credits are invalidated, the end user has to replace them, the buyer, not the forest owner, unless the buyer is bankrupt. But the key thing is that a lot of buyers try to push that liability onto the sellers, and it's going to be important if you're considering a project to make sure that you don't take on that liability. So I'm going to go for about another 5 minutes to do about 20. So the project development and maintenance process, you're going to look at a feasibility assessment, then you have to do a project listing into inventory design and installation, your project and baseline scenario modeling, offset project data report, third-party verification, ARB offset credit issuance, and then you're going into ongoing monitoring. And the key from starting, most landowners think about whether they want to do a project for a year or two, because this is a longer-term commitment. And so a lot of landowners considering will investigate this for a while. But once they decide to go, you're looking at it at least 9 to 12 months. It can be longer, and tribal projects can be more complicated from a legal perspective, so it can take longer to go to go from saying go to a verification. So a couple things that I just want to flag. The first thing is that this is just a tool. This is not a panacea. It's not. It has risks and benefits, costs and revenues, and one of the key aspects is a goodness of fit with your own objectives. What are your objectives on the land, and how does this help you achieve them? And if it doesn't, then it's not a good fit. So that's a key consideration. Obviously, the 100-year permanence obligation. You're considering your forecast revenue versus your opportunity cost, what you can make with selling logs that you might be committing to the carbon storage. In some areas that pencils out quite well, where you're making a multiple from the carbon market that you would in the log market. In some areas it doesn't, so that's an important consideration. These projects do require for tribes a limited waiver of sovereign immunity to the California state government. So it's a government-to-government agreement. It's a negotiated agreement that does not become public. We can talk a bit about that later. On trust land in particular, it does require BIA approval. We'll talk about this as well. It's important to consider one project versus multiple projects. Multiple projects in the same area will have higher cost, but also potentially reduced risk and more management flexibility. And so that's something to consider. And then focusing on the key risks. So there's price risk. This is a commodity market like any other commodity market. How do you mitigate your risk? If you're doing one of these projects, how do you make sure you're getting close to the revenue or achieving or beating the revenue that you're targeting? Inventory quality is very important. You guys all have CFIs. You can build on those CFIs. I wouldn't advise using an old CFI or just using your own CFI data. I would advise augmenting the same plots to achieve a good carbon inventory. But inventory quality is very important because these inventory plots will be remeasured for verification over a long period of time. And then, as I mentioned, it's important to think about offset and validation risk. I'll discuss a little bit about this down the road, but it's an issue we're working on with a number of tribes. And I think I'm hopeful that one of the outcomes of this workshop will be a group within ITC that can focus on some of these policy issues that are coming up. The ARB, the California Air Resources Board, is currently considering treating forest management plans as a binding legal constraint on baselines, even though in your forest management plan you can target a sustained yield of 10-year pulp or 100-year saw logs, and you can do what you want in the forest management plan. But this policy would severely reduce the ability of tribes to participate in these projects. And then I won't get into, I have some considerations about project developers in the last minute. If you have a great in-house biostatistics, sampling design, growth and yield modeling, tribes can do these projects in-house with large forestry departments, and you should consider that. Some tribes consider doing an initial project with a third-party developer gaining a book of offset customers, and then expanding thereafter. So it is something to consider. And when you're looking, key is strong alignment of interests. Check their references. How long are they committing? Their track record. And so alignment of interest is key. You want to make sure that whoever you decide to work with is working for you, not for an offset buyer, and that their incentives are aligned with your incentives. So this is a tool. It's a useful tool, and it's worth investigating and taking your time. This is a long-term decision. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and then Greg's going to chat a little bit about his perspective. Brian, did you want to?
Our next speaker is Greg Blomstrom, and Greg is a third-generation Californian, born in Berkeley in the same hospital as his mother. Greg got his BS in forestry in 1972 at Humboldt State University and has been practicing forestry ever since. Greg is a co-owner, along with 6 others, in Baldwin, Blomstrom, Wilkinson & Associates, a consulting firm, a consulting forestry business that practices sustainable forestry and works throughout the West with tribes. In the last several years, Greg's firm has assisted in the completion of 4 fully registered and verified California carbon projects, including 2 on tribal lands. Prior to forming BB&W in 2002, Greg worked for 20 years as a forester in the Hoopa Valley tribe in Hoopa, California. Greg, welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Brian. I'm often the odd man out at these Intertribal Timber Council symposia. My wife and I are vegetarians. And Brian didn't mention it, but my bio at the very end said I have a reverence for nature, except for deer, slugs, and raccoons. And the slugs and the deer are associated with being a vegetarian. You could ask me later about raccoons. So I'm going to talk about our firm's experience working on tribal projects in California, essentially, and in working with New Forests. We have a strategic partnership where we work with New Forests and advise them on particular California forest practice rule issues and prescriptions, inventory, etc. But I want everyone to know that Brian's firm works throughout the United States to register projects anywhere in the U.S., and any one of you anywhere in the U.S. could register a project that would receive credits from the California cap and trade system. So it's not something where if you don't have property in California, you can't do anything. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience, about the 100-year commitment of carbon project, natural forest management, sustainable harvesting, and the other items there. I don't need to read them off. So our firm has spent 13 years writing over 140 forest management plans on Indian land in the U.S., mostly in California, where there are a lot of public domain Indian allotments, but we have a lot of experience working in Indian land. One of my colleagues and I have 35 years working directly with the Hoopa Valley tribe or other tribes. We've completed CFIs on multiple reservations, assisted in fact, Brian's already mentioned that we've worked on carbon projects. And we're working on several new projects with Brian, and we have considerable experience working in California, the West, but in particular on tribal lands throughout the U.S., mostly in the West. So these observations are associated with the experience that we've gained over the 2 projects on tribal land in particular. And I'm kind of a dirt forester kind of guy, so these are the things that tribal people, staff, council members, and others have brought up to us as issues about doing carbon projects on your property. So what about the 100-year commitment? Well, it's not a contract. You're not signing a contract with the state of California. It's an attestation that you're going to maintain those stocks on your property for 100 years. If the law creating the cap and trade system goes away, then your commitment goes away. And it's not really any different than cutting a tree down for timber harvest purposes without a carbon project. So let's look at this example. This is a property that does have a carbon project. You can see there's a tree on your right that's got blue paint disease. It's marked for harvest. I marked that tree. It's a commitment by the landowner that once that tree is cut, his goal is to have big old trees on the property forever. He's making a commitment to replace that tree and create another, not create, but grow another tree that'll be at least as big as the one that's marked or bigger, but that's a 100-year commitment on his part. And that's not really much different than the tree on the left, which, because his property has a carbon project on it, he's also committing to maintain that tree or several trees like it for 100 years. And so in effect, you can have the same commitment, whether it's carbon or the timber harvest, and it's, depends on site and on rotation, but you could have a similar commitment on a 100-year basis for either type of activity. Here's another 100-year commitment. Let's say the forest in the background is at rotation, it's 100 years old, and you've just put in a clear cut in front of it, and it's 0 years old. You've made a 100-year commitment to grow timber back to that kind of condition about the forest in the back. So that's not much different in terms of length of time than it would be if it were a carbon commitment. So there's a requirement in the protocol to conduct natural forest management. So one of the aspects of the protocol is you have to maintain or increase standing livestock over the life of your project. And you can read some of the other things. You're going to have verified progress, which means you're going to have a verifier commit or verify that your stocks are increasing. They have to manage the distribution of habitat and age classes that's natural. And an important one here is no more than 40% of the project area can be in stands that are less than 20 years old. So you have to really think about that in terms of even-aged management. So you have to also meet a test of sustainability, and for most tribes this is going to be pretty easy, and in my experience with private landowners in California anyway, most don't have a management plan, at least not approved by the state, whereas with tribes you could meet that requirement to have sustainable harvest practices by having a BIA approved management plan. And this morning Dave showed that 79% of tribes have approved management plans that cover 94% of the trust land in the U.S. You can also meet the requirement of sustainable forest management by employing uneven age silviculture and have 40% canopy cover, or you could be FSC certified. You only have to meet one of those. Brian mentioned you have to meet, or you must issue a waiver of sovereign immunity, and this is the language directly out of the protocol. The governing body of the tribe must enter into a limited waiver of sovereign immunity, and you can read the rest. I'm not going to elaborate it. And that's something that you have to take on as a tribal staff or council member. Probably in other cases, there have been limited waivers of immunity for other reasons that you've entered into for one reason or another. And that might be the basis for you to start looking at whether or not those might work for cap and trade. You got to have BIA approval. Now, it doesn't mean that that's a contract. In the case of the Round Valley tribe, that was a letter that was signed by the regional director saying that the tribe could move forward with a cap and trade project. But that's not necessarily something that happens overnight. I mean, as good a relationship as you might have with your regional director, that's a pretty big commitment on both of your sides, on the regional director and on the tribal side, to enter into the cap and trade system, and it's not something that you want to leave to the last minute on a carbon project. So Brian mentioned CFI plots. Tribes have lots of great CFI data, and they'll give you a good estimate of whether or not you might have a project, and it's financially feasible. And if you've got a recently measured CFI, that might actually suffice for a project that you would have sufficient statistical reliability in order to make, or in order to register a project. If you're 3 years or more since measurement, I think you're almost certainly going to have to go back and remeasure. And some of that could be covered depending on your agreement and your process for registering a project. That might be covered by a broker. The cost to measure might be covered by a broker. If you're doing it on your own, you're going to undertake that cost on your own. The statistical standard, most of us work in timber sales where you've got one standard deviation of confidence. Here it's 5 to 7% standard error at the 90% level. That's a pretty tough standard. That's why CFI may or may not work. So here are some examples of projects. I only got a couple of more slides. Your properties that, let's say you're managing your property, it's currently a culmination of board foot annual increment, more or less. It's kind of old trees. And your goal is to take it down to very young, small trees for whatever reason. And that's not likely going to be a great carbon project. If your property is managed for a cubic foot culmination of mean annual increment and you intend to keep it that way, it could be a project. You might be growing trees not to a really old age, but you're trying to increase stocking, you're trying to maintain cover everywhere. That could work, particularly if the surrounding landowners, say in the south, are managing on a short rotation. If you've got a property that's really well stocked, and you tend to keep it that way, carbon could be a great project. It could really help fill in revenue stream when you've got years when maybe the timber market's down. And then probably the sort of preeminent project is one where you're trying to build stocking and your goal is a bigger, older forest, maybe more fire resilient, less brush on the ground, bigger, older trees. That's likely to be a good project. So, not for everyone. It's good where you're building inventory. Doesn't work that well when you're doing a lot of even-aged management. And it won't work without BIA approval or a waiver of sovereign immunity. But there are some pretty substantial financial benefits. And that is it. Thank you.